We've got three amazing experts from communication practice. I'll first introduce them and ask them to give us some insights from their experience as media professionals, and afterwards we will discuss what we can learn for the public debate about planetary health. I would like to start with Henriette Lewis. Henriette Lewis is the head of Deutsche Journalistenschule. Deutsche Journalistenschule is Germany's most renowned independent journalism school. In her previous job, she was a professor of the University of Montana in Missoula and directed the graduate program in environmental and natural resources journalism. She's a trained journalist and a fierce proponent of journalism education. In a recent discussion, she said that future journalists have to be able to use, convey, and scrutinize both scientific findings and technical achievements. Henriette, what does it take for journalism to succeed in covering planetary health, and how do we educate journalists in a way they can achieve
that? Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here. By the way, just as an aside, because you said that planetary health is still a concept that people are not familiar with. When I was in Montana, there was the kind of flavor of the day was something called systems ecology, something that nobody understood at the time. So I'm kind of familiar with the challenge. I have one slide, so I'll briefly see whether I can, yeah, I can, right? We can see the slide. And I'll be brief. I think this is a really interesting moment for journalism, an interesting moment in history.
Actually, Henriette, at the moment we do see
my text.
Your text.
Okay. Okay, so then I have to stop the slide, because if not, I'm telling right. I can't figure out how to do that. Anyway, so it's an interesting moment because we can kind of start touching concepts like planetary health and climate change instead of just kind of theorizing about them, I guess. And that is an opportunity for journalism, I think, but it's also a challenge. And basically, to my mind, when I talk to the students or think about the curriculum of our school, there are two concepts that I have in mind. One is the concept of credibility. The media has, as we all know, a credibility problem, and we need to win back that credibility. And I think that to do that, journalists need to be trained to really understand science. They need to understand concepts like planetary health and grasp them so they can tell stories in a convincing way, in an engaging way, and also in a way that's independent of the people who kind of drive the story. And besides the credibility issue, there's the issue of, I would say, respect. I would call it respect. I think we are very aware of the fact that parts of the public feel that anything that's related to climate change, any issue related to it, is an elite issue. And this feeling that parts of the public have is, of course, exploited by those who don't want us to address climate change, who don't want us to address other drivers of planetary health. I recently heard an interview with, I think, George Marshall on the BBC, where he talked about how people in traditional coal regions feel, that they feel disrespected by activists and journalists who blame coal for the climate crisis, because they feel that their accomplishments and traditions are ignored and discounted. And the same happens, like recently when we covered the extreme weather events, like the flood in Germany, and immediately the media drew the connection to climate change. People feel that this is kind of callous, and you know, it reminded me that we really need to give working people the time of the day, and we really need to listen. So part of this is our credibility as communicators, but the other part is the respect we need to show our audiences. So on the upside, I think if we at DJS and elsewhere can train the next generation of journalists in science coverage so that they're really as comfortable with covering science and concepts as they are with covering the political horse race. And if we can also train them to look at the public outside their own bubble and show those people more respect, then we have a chance to regain trust, and trust is what we need. And I think this is true for the other stakeholders and participants in planetary health communication as well. You know, trust is what we need as the basis for communicating in a way that will help us all to a better future. Rest my case.
Thank you very much, Henriette. I just had a message from just to let you all know, had a message from Philipp Dettmer that he's late, but he will join us a bit later, so I'll have to rearrange a bit, and would go on first with the statement of Astrid, and then we can talk a bit about the field of journalism and planetary health, and later on we'll include Philipp into the conversation. So the next person I would like to introduce to you is Astrid Viciano. She is the editor of Medien-Doktor Gesundheit, a medical reporter and a trained physician, but also a trained journalist. As a specialist in health communication, she's well rooted in both worlds, medicine and media. This cross-border quality is also mirrored in her personal life, with stops in more than half a dozen different countries, from what I perceived from your CV. So Astrid, can you give us some insights from your journalistic experience in crossing all these different borders, from the different approaches in science and health journalism, which can be relevant for communicating planetary health? So I do see your presentation seems to work, but I don't hear you yet.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here today, and as Mr. Goodwin already mentioned, I'm a medical doctor originally, and I'm the senior editor of the German health news review, the Medien-Doktor. And I've been working as a medical reporter for more than 20 years now. And I remember when I started working a long time ago, my focus would be very narrow when I was reporting. So I would focus on the new scientific paper that was published, on the new medical therapy that was being talked about. And after a few years, I had the feeling that this focus was too narrow, that often when I did the research on a certain topic, the result would be incomplete. And just to maybe show you a little bit of what I mean, maybe in a very simple way is, if you look at this avocado, what do you think of? Do you think of this very healthy vegetable that has so many omega-3 fatty acids that might help you to prevent cardiovascular disease? Or do you rather look at, think about the amount of water that is needed in order to grow this vegetable? Or perhaps at the forests that are being burned down in regions such as in Michoacan in Mexico in order to grow these plants? What about if we did the reporting on both aspects, not just on the health aspect or the environmental aspect, but to do both for one piece, for one article? And this is something that I started to do a few years ago in other topics, dealing with other topics. So I decided to cross borders, so to speak. I decided to get out of this narrow field of highly specialized medical reporting and focus on other aspects. And for instance, I did research on the tobacco industry. and how the tobacco industry was entering the e-cigarette market. So I not only focused on the effects, on the consequences that cigarettes or electronic cigarettes might have on the health of the consumers, but also how the tobacco industry invading, so to speak, the e-cigarette industry changed the behavior of the consumer. Or just to give you another example where I tried to cross borders was to look at different speech recognition techniques, technologies. That is not only to look at the science on how these technologies work, but actually how they are being used and whether they're reliable. So many of these technologies are being used in order to analyze whether a refugee is actually coming from the country he or she is actually claiming to come from. And it turned out that many of these technologies are not very reliable. And so this methodology, this technology that is not very reliable, of course, has a large impact on the refugees that are being analyzed. And another topic I started to focus on like 1.5 years ago was the topic of drug pricing. So I not only looked as a health journalist at the different cancer therapies that are being developed or the gene therapies that are being developed and that have a huge impact on the patient that need these therapies, but also I looked into the prices and why many of these therapies are so prohibitively expensive. So I tried to broaden my research and my way of working as a medical journalist. And I soon found out or realized that this did not fit in very well with the anatomy of a newsroom, because at a newspaper or a magazine, you have different sections. So you have the sections, the science and the health section, you have a section on politics, they have a section on finance, on culture, etc. And even within the sections, for example, within the science and health section, you have experts. You have journalists with different expertise, for example, in biology, in physics, in medicine. And even among these specialized journalists, you have biologists that only focus on molecular biology. So we have very highly specialized reporters working. And then, of course, also the PR professionals that are approaching reporters because they know they are very specialized in a specific field. So I was wondering, how do these journalists actually work? And if you look at how health journalists work, first of all, he looks, of course, what's new. He looks into scientific papers and conferences. Then he looks if it's about a new therapy or a new drug, whether it actually works, and tries to give advice to the readers. And a very important part, of course, is also to tell a personal story on how patients cope with a certain illness or how they try to get a certain therapy. And finally, to have a critical insight into the topic, if there are any conflicts of interest and where the money is flowing of a new therapy that is being developed. And then when you look at environmental journalists, at some point you will see it's not so different how environmental journalists work. They also look at what's new. They look at scientific papers. Traditionally, they're a bit more political, I believe, than medical journalists that are more in their niche of reporting. But they also work, does a certain project work? They want to give advice. They want to show whether it's helping a certain population and give critical insight. So as we see, environmental journalists and health journalists in many cases work in a very similar way. So what's actually impeding them to focus on topics that actually overlap, that would mean to cross borders, such as planetary health? And I believe there's a certain aspect that would really help them to dive into new topics and to broaden their perspective. And one of the things that might help them would be, for example, project or institutions such as we at the German Health Review offer, that we have developed certain quality criteria for reporting, not only on health, but also on environmental reporting. So journalists can look at our website, but also, of course, at other institutions that provide information and how to do quality reporting on environmental and health reporting. Then we have huge networks for journalists, such as Hostwriter, a huge international platform where reporters can look for other reporters that work in the other field, so they can team up and work together on a certain topic in order to cross borders together, so to speak. And one aspect that is, of course, very important, because many of these journalists that team up in order to cross borders together are freelance journalists traditionally. So what they would need is financing. So there's, for example, this journalism fund that gives stipends to journalists from at least 2 different countries who want to publish in at least 2 different countries, who work together. And often they're not also only from 2 different countries, but also working in different areas of journalism. And finally, another project such as the project from the Robert Bosch Foundation and the Riff Reporter platform. It's called the Masterclass of Science Journalism. And this year, it started last year, there was this new program of science journalists going into libraries. And so it's not only about crossing borders in the way you approach a topic and to have a broader perspective on what you want to report upon, but also to change your way of presenting your work. That is to give lectures in a library, to prepare an exposition, or even to develop a theater play for kids. So what we need in order to enable journalists to cross borders, to work on topics that have a broader focus than they usually work in a highly specialized field, I think one is to help them gain expertise. So to have more education, seminars, research trips to interesting institutions, maybe even bachelor or master's programs. Then financing, a very important part in order to enable them to do that, to establish grants and fellowships for these reporters, and also to organize conferences to enable these reporters to present the work they have done together, and also be able to network, because at the end, all reporters want the same. They want to have a good story, they want to do quality reporting, they want to be evidence-based, and ideally they want to have an impact on society. And by enabling them, by providing them with these different aspects, we can help them to reach these goals, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Astrid, and thank you, Henriette, for your insights. That's really helpful, and it really shows that journalism can play quite a vital role, and that actually it's always about about crossing borders and about leaving the silos of the specific sections behind you, but also leaving the bubble of your middle class background as a journalist behind you. And Henriette, what do you think? What can we do in science, in journalism education as a whole, but of course also in science journalism education, to make sure that this respect aspect you mentioned can be achieved, while still a lot of journalism students are from more a narrow background than a broad background in society?
Part of it is to diversify journalism. But apart from that, I think we are experimenting a lot and pursuing a lot the idea of students testing their story ideas, for example, testing their format ideas with members of the public, with really, showing them, this is what I want to do. We recently did a project for a regional newspaper, which was, developing a new format for covering climate change in the region. And on every step of the way, they had to find individuals, basically pick them up on the streets, find focus groups, and show them their prototypes and see how they responded and what they said. So that's kind of like a good start, I think, right? But you have to approach people deliberately. You know, you can't just kind of wait for them to come to you, because the people who come to you to respond to your coverage are extremists, Lautsprecher, loudspeakers, people who scream and yell at you. And I mean, a lot of you know this, this phenomenon. So you have to go and approach the kind of normal people to gather their knowledge and ideas and feelings.
I think that's something we really need to make sure to also keep in mind with our Munich Science Communication Lab, to not only preach to the converted, preach to those people who are already into science communication, but to reach audiences who are beyond that. And also, and not only the audiences who are also not reached by science communication, but just normal people. And I think that's a challenge we're really trying to take. Another thing which I saw with your examples, Astrid, was this, this team approach. And I think there's a change in journalism in general. From when I grew up, we were talking in German about Edelfedern, so the very noble noble pens, maybe to translate it verbatim. The very high class, single-minded journalists, probably older male guy sitting secluded and writing about the world. And now we have teams, even really large teams, working on data and but also working on research, not only like data research, but working on projects like you showed us, Astrid. Do you think that is one of the keys which will propel the possibilities for science journalism to cross borders?
I do, actually. I think, first of all, well, I experienced myself actually when I was starting to cross borders to look into different other topics such as finances, which I didn't know much about as a medical doctor. And it takes some courage to go into another field and to delve into a different topic that you're not specialized in. And I think it helps very much if you team up with someone who has been working on this kind of topic, maybe for a few years already, who can give you advice. And also it's not only teaming up in the sense that one works on one aspect and the other one on the other aspect that he or she knows about, but also it's a way of combining the knowledge of both, because I think I do have a different perspective on environmental topics than environmental journalists, because I don't know that much about, but maybe then I have more the perspective of the general public than a highly specialized environmental reporter, and the other way around also. So I think it can help at many levels, but I think for many journalists, it can help very much to team up with someone else. And I do think that this is, well, especially of course in investigative journalism, but also in other kinds of journalism, it's a big trend. And I think it's something that will enable us to do very much of this, much more, of this cross-border reporting.
And it also helps to combine resources, because you also spoke to the problem of finances. You said that foundations might be a revenue source there, but I'm getting suspicious here. You know, if I have a topic like planetary health, which is already good, you know, and I've already got the neutrality problem as a journalist, that I do want to stay neutral, I do want to stay critical. And then I also take the money of an organization which is interested in having me do reporting about that. So how do you make sure to stay neutral here?
Well, it depends, of course, very much on the foundation and on how strict the requirements are. When I or my teams, we apply for a fellowship, we always look at whether they want to influence in any way our reporting, and if there are like particular topics that we have to approach within the fellowship. So we'll look at the institution, of course, and how it is financed, and then also if they want to influence our reporting. If they want to do so, then we would not apply for that kind of fellowship. But it would not only be foundations, can also be for example, institutions such as the European Journalism Center, for instance. It's not only foundations, of course.
And it's also aligns with the current call for sustainable resources for public service media, of course, because that's another way to have sustainable resources for good journalism. Henriette, how do you make sure with like young idealistic journalism students to show them to stay neutral even in a topic where their heart really goes out to one side of the story?
My approach is more that they have to be honest about it, and that they have to kind of go out of their way to tell people where they're coming from and what their perspective is. I mean, I think they basically have two choices. They can decide to preach to a specific audience, or I should rather not say preach, but to speak to a specific community and to be the truth tellers to those communities, right? We barely have any journalists like that. We barely have journalists in the Fridays for Future movement who kind of feel part of the movement, just as you and I are feeling part of democracy, but who feel that their work is to tell the community where it might go wrong, right? Or where it is blind in certain areas, right? So that's one thing people can choose, I think. The other is they want to continue for mainstream media, so-called mainstream media, right? And these media organizations have a much broader audience, and they have to kind of be honest to that audience and say, okay, here, here's who I am. Here is why I am reporting this story. Here's how I went into reporting this story. Here is how maybe my mind was changed by what I found, right? And that's very hard for old traditional newspapers to do. They're only slowly doing this because they said, why? We have no reason to justify what we're doing. We're journalists, right? We have ethics. Our readers know this. No, our readers do not know this anymore, right? Does that answer your question to some degree?
Even more than that. So thank you very much. I think it's a good point to now include Philipp Dettmer into the conversation. He's the person behind Kurzgesagt in a nutshell, the YouTube channel. He's an information designer from Munich, Germany. I first came across his magical film Night Session about skateboarding kids from Munich. The same magic he puts into science communication through information design, rich videos on the Kurzgesagt video channel. You will learn a lot about faraway stars, human history, and the current state of our planet. Philipp, how do you communicate knowledge, and what have you learned about science communication?
Thank you very much for the introduction. How do we communicate knowledge? Oh my God. Okay. So I guess, like, first of all, we try to be very concise and I call it like using human language. So we try to avoid all sorts of complicated language and expert talk. We're not naming too much. We try to break everything down to its most central component and go from there. So my goal when we do a communication piece is that someone can watch it with their grandchildren and every generation is still entertained. So I guess, not being too complicated, also being entertaining is the most.
with this field, Planetary House, that we are talking about, and that's a field which is very complicated itself. We are saying this is a wicked problem we want to address, so it's something where we really need to make sure that science is correct, but but there are no quick fixes. You know, we can't just say, well, just switch to this product and then everything will be fine. So how do we make sure to stay correct, to stay not too complicated, but not to be like too simple also? No. So how do we make sure that all these three conditions are applied?
I mean, like especially for this like topic of planetary health, I don't think there's like one answer here. I think we need to do all of these things in different pieces. The topic of like climate change and planetary health is so complicated and so complex that like you can go into so many. You can go like from the just like the climate science, like the atmosphere, or like the ecosystems dying, like the heating of the oceans, the acidification of the oceans. There's there's so many topics here. So I think it's important to not treat it as one topic, but like as a field, and you can't communicate it as one thing. Like whenever we try to do that, I think it's like it has to fail to some degree. But I think it's important to look at it as a thing where you need to do many communication pieces. It's like instead of like trying, I don't think it's possible to break this down into like one thing really.
And that's the reason why entertainment is an important factor. So to keep to have an aesthetic way to present it, to have good narratives, to make sure that that people are willing to follow even longer stories, and how do you make sure that there is entertainment in a topic where there's also a lot of doom?
Yeah, we honestly struggle with that. We really do, because like if you especially in the last few years, like I think the science shifted a little bit. Everything got more and more alarmist, and that, like if you do that too much, people just like lose all hope, and then moral licensing becomes a problem where everybody thinks, okay, like the world is doomed anyway. It doesn't matter what I do. I can fly as much as I want. I go like I look at these places before they like disappear and contribute to destroying them. We try, like when we talk about these topics, we try to incorporate always like a hopeful message like within it, even if things are not always that hopeful, to at least like show some sort of perspective where we could go to fix this. But it's honestly not easy. Like we struggle with that ourselves. It's like when we do climate change related topics, we try to pick like one topic, treat it as like a little bit as a bubble, go through that, make this like an entertaining story. Don't crank up the doom too much, and try to like all end on a maybe not like stupidly hopeful, but like in a sense like, hey, this is what we could do. Like always like include the message that it's not over yet. Because there are some communication pieces that like gives this or like these like it radiates those feelings that actually it doesn't matter what we do anyway. It is over. It is completely lost, which is like horrible. I don't know. Yeah.
I think that's it's the question of the role of communication, of public debate, of journalism as a whole, and maybe that's a question the other panelists also could pitch in, is to show different ways, and not to say it needs to be this way, but to show different possibilities and make them accessible for the public debate, so they can choose which is the right or which they want to go based on their values. Henriette, is that a description of science in journalism which is valid, that we don't go into this there's no alternative corner of the discussion, but to say, well, these are the alternatives?
Well, there's like, I don't know, maybe Astrid wants to talk about that, or whether she's interested in this whole concept of constructive journalism. I'm not, I'm not against the constructive journalism, but I'm not really like a huge, I don't know very much about it. But let me briefly say one thing that I think goes in that direction, but it's again very concrete. Somebody asked in the chat about whether the solution is to go to the coal miner who became builds wind turbines and tells their stories. And that's, unfortunately, it's too simple. That's too, so I would suggest that you find a family of coal miners, 3 generations, where the youngest generation has somebody who now builds wind turbines. And you do some kind of talk show from the kitchen table of this family where they debate questions like planetary health. And you help them, to debate this question. And that's how you capture, I think, audiences, because it has entertainment value, it's authentic. And the question is really, how do you make this discussion sound and science-based, right? That's what we have to do as journalists. But we have to twist it a little bit further, I think, than just showing the good examples, right?
Astrid?
I think it depends very much on the topic you're approaching. Showing different alternatives in one article, different solutions, and then leaving it up to the reader to decide which one of the solution might seem the best one to him or her. I must admit, I have almost never done that, because there's, I think, a certain tendency in journalism to get to some sort of conclusion at the end. Maybe a balanced conclusion, but it's like, I think I would hear from media editors, but what do we do now? What do you want to say? So I think the matter lies more into having a balanced and nuanced way of reporting. So not only to focus too much on one of the aspects and leaving out most of the others, or just mentioning them a little bit, but try to do a very balanced approach. And when you ask about presenting solutions, I must say it really depends. I do not search for solutions every time I do an article. And I think it's also, I do very much, one of my main focuses is investigative reporting. So it's more unveiling something that is not going well and hoping to have some impact to find a solution or to change something, hopefully. So it's more a matter of criticizing, unveiling something that is perhaps not known or not known very well, and then leading up to a solution maybe afterwards in order to through the audience, hopefully. Sometimes I do, I mean, it's very attractive sometimes, of course, to look for a solution. For example, I mentioned the projects I did on drug pricing during the last 1.5 years. And I found out that some clinics, some university hospitals now try to produce their own cancer therapies to make them less expensive. That's, of course, a very attractive solution. I think that's very interesting, I hope, for the readers, and something that I can present as a hopeful perspective, comparing to the high pricing of many of the pharmaceutical companies. So I cannot give you a general answer. It depends very much on the approach on the topic, but I certainly would not look for a solution in every topic I'm reporting on.
A general answer is probably would be kind of funny if there would have been one just in this topic about finding general answers on, or the impossibility of ones. Julia, You've got your eyes on the chat. Could you read one of the more frequent questions asked?
Yeah, well, there are again a lot of questions. Actually, every question in a bit of a different direction. Hans van Brosius is pointing to the problem, yeah, from the system logic, so to speak, from journalism and media, which sometimes differs from the perspective of science, and he criticizes that the underlying assumption is that journalists want to convey information from science the best way well, as scientists think, and he doubts this, that journalists have their own interests. He says scientists often serve as compliant witnesses to underpin opinions journalists have on societal problems, and he explains that he was often interviewed with the only goal to make him say what the journalists want to hear. So what do you think about this, Henriette, Astrid?
I can totally, but you know, like politicians feel that way too.
I can give you like a funny example, Henriette, if you want one. One day before Christmas, a journalist from the Bavarian broadcasting station called me and said, "Isn't it awful that on Christmas Eve there are action movies in in several of the private TV channels?" And I said, "I don't think so, as long as you can see a crisp mass or whatever, as long as there's the diversity and you can select what you want." But she said, "But it's not Christian. Isn't it awful?" And I said, "No, it's not awful." And then, to make a long story short, at the end, she said, "Do you know somebody who will say that it's awful?" And this is what I mean with compliant witness. Yeah? They go and search for somebody who gives in, and this is, I mean, what we should keep that in mind, that we sometimes are that we are used as scientists. If you say as a scientist, there's a chance that the temperature will raise for 4 degrees. You will be in every media outlet. Even if you say this, the chance is very small and it's very unlikely, but 4 degrees, wow. And this is one of the problems we should also not forget in our discussion about science communication and society.
Yeah, I agree. But you know, there is a solution for that, and it's something that we've done in the last. We've just started doing this 6 months ago, and what it does is it brings together scientists and journalists when they're really young, and puts them into an experimental situation where they have to kind of interview each other without really being experts in the field. You know, the journalists are not experts, and then this interview is recorded and then watched together afterwards. And it's an incredible starting point for discovering exactly these phenomena that, you know, as you describe, and to understand each other's logic, right? Without succumbing to the other's logic, you know, but kind of understanding each other's logic and developing a respect for why the other side acts the way they act. It's really seriously something where you have this aha effect and people have this epiphany on both sides and something switches and they understand, right? And it's not very hard to do. I don't know why we've just started doing it, but we're doing it now with people from Leibniz and Helmholtz soon, and it works perfectly. So I hope that that's going to change things.
If I might add to this, my experience is a bit different. I know that, of course, this exists, and I understand that you have experienced this, and that there are some reporters that only look for a quote that's missing in the article to complete their article. But I think particularly in the science and health journalism field, many of the reporters come from science. So they're biologists, they're chemists, they're medical doctors. So often it's maybe the other way around, that they feel too close to scientists, too close to the medical doctors, that they have difficulties of stepping back and have a critical look on what scientists or medical doctors are actually doing and ask critical questions. So I think it really depends on the field you're looking in. I think science journals may be a bit different in many cases. And I do think that there are quite a number of science journalists that, as I mentioned, that would not look for the quote, but rather would go along too much with what the scientist or the medical author is telling them. So I think it really depends on whom you're talking to.
Or even sends the scientist the story to review and approve, exactly. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Maybe, Philipp, did you have that experience yourself, that doing research for one of your clips, they were destroyed by the facts, that you had an idea in mind and you really have a great clip you want to do about a certain topic, and then on the way you find out, no, the reality is different?
Yeah, constantly, and it's very annoying when that happens. Like when you start doing a topic and you know the story, or you think you know the story and where you want to go, and when you know the conclusion, and then you do the research or talk to like what we do to avoid like the scientist confusion, we always try to have like two different experts that we like show the script we make independently and have them give feedback independently. So even that we get feedback from two different sources. And yeah, it's very annoying, and also sadly happens pretty regularly that like for one, like the story we wanted to tell like doesn't work because it's not true, or like the experts maybe have different opinions, and then you need to see like, okay, how do I deal with that? Like for example, we did a few pieces on nuclear energy, and it's like very hard to actually get like what is the reality here actually, because like we spoke to like I think we had 4 different scientists, and each and every one of them had a different opinion. So we found like we really had to work hard to find a way to like get something out in the end where we felt okay, we can live with these conclusions, even if like independently not all 4 would be super happy, but like somehow mold like a sort of consensus, yeah, so that we can live to show to our viewers.
And maybe, so the example that Hans-Bernd gave and Constanze Rossmann also mentioned in the chat, that she's also experienced this might be something which is particularly true for social sciences, because maybe I guess a lot of journalists will really be on the same page and really know that they are not experts in nuclear energy production. But in societies, especially in the media, they are probably experts. And from the question on communicating planetary health, which is the broader topic of this session, is the question on communicating about communication of planetary health. And having the problem that here, journalists might have the feeling that they already know, and that they can quite easily, tell the stories themselves and find the right sources for that.
Can I show us in one more thing? Like since we're talking on this, like from the one side. So what we encountered also, like since there's a reason we are now working with different experts for every video, because like we had the opposite happen, that like some scientists were like felt a little bit like activists, I guess, and like really had like an agenda is such an overused word in our time, but like had an idea of like how they want to see something presented. And then we did, like when we published then something, we got a lot of feedback, like in the direction like that's like not actually consensus, or like that's like a fringe opinion or something. So it can go the other way around. Like if you interview the wrong person, or if you only interview one person, there's a danger here too, to just like be the mouthpiece of someone who has like an agenda, I guess. Even I don't like this word, but yeah.
Thank you very much to pointing us in this direction, because maybe for the other two people for Henriette, also from the journalism education perspective, how do you to make sure to spot the activist in the science source?
That's a tricky question. Buzzwords, maybe. You know, but it's hard to say whether science is probably smart enough not to do this. But usually journalists recognize superlatives, right? Extremely great danger, catastrophic, you know, whatever. And that's when you notice there's an activist here. But you know, scientists might be too smart. Astrid, you have to answer this question. I'm sure you're much better.
Actually, I would put another spin on it, because I would ask whether the activist is a bad source. You know, as long as you know how to rein them in.
Well, I will try to put my perspective on this. I've noticed, since I've been working in different fields where activism is very strong, tobacco, drug pricing, there are many activists, of course, working in these different fields. And what I've found out for myself a little bit in the last few years was most of the times, the activists point out to different studies, scientific studies, and then they say, oh, this study showed very clearly that this happened, or this is not good, or this therapy doesn't work, or whatever. And then when I go into the scientific paper, I often discover that this paper does not say that, or not only say that. And that's where I become suspicious, when somebody is really only taking out certain information, or perhaps claiming something that's not even in the paper. That happened to me lately in one of my projects. Then I think, oh, I should be careful there. But I find it interesting that you ask about if we should include activists in our research, because that's something I very often do in my investigative stories, because often these activists, when maybe it's a question also of how you define an activist, but like NGOs that work on certain topics and do very intense, very thorough work in different fields, are a very good source for me often, because they have studied a certain field for a long time. But of course, they cannot be my only source. So that's one source, but then I have to look at the other side and the other sides, most likely. So I think one of the ways to get a more balanced view, and also to find out what an activist is to ask other people about them or about the topic.
Another thing that Philipp just pointed to was actually their own community. You know, you said that after publishing your piece, your audience responded and showed you where you might be one-sided. And is it something where we in the future we will include our audiences more in the research, in finding good topics, but also even correcting ourselves? How do you build an audience to be a trustful source themselves, Philipp?
I mean, I can really only speak from like our experience, and because it's a hard thing to do, I guess. I mean, to like gain the trust of people, well, you need to like it is a thing built over time. And for us, what worked, for example, is just like over time getting more transparent, like publishing our sources. Like by now, like for every video we do, we publish a sources sheet that's like between 20 and 60 pages with like every relevant statement in the video. Like, how did we get there? What are the sources for the statement? We show like which experts we talk to, like, and what they said. Like we tell, like, in science communication, it's basically impossible not to lie. You have to. You can't like tell the science like completely in that detail that like you research it, because like you can't, like, and it's not communication anymore. Then just people can then just read the papers. So you need to like summarize a little bit, and that often distorts facts a little bit. And that we try to be open about that. For one, that we are doing that, and then in our source sheet where we did that and why. And on the other side, what we have good experience with, like obviously we make mistakes too because we are people. And when we do, we're just like open about that and say like, hey, in this video, we did say this thing. Turns out it's like not exactly right. Like we should have phrased that differently. So just like being open with mistakes and just the whole process. Yeah. And if you do that over time, or at least that's like my or like our experience with the channel, like being constantly transparent and open about like how difficult the process is and where we screwed up.
Is this something where it's also change in journalism as a field, where because of the amount of the kind of unlimited amount of space we have in the internet, Astrid, what would you say? Is it possible to be more transparent about all your sources, because you've got a lot of room for footnotes, and to be also transparent about your errors, because you can post corrections. At least you won't reach everybody who read the story, but you can post corrections on that story.
I think that's something that many media are doing much more than they used to do a few years ago, such as, for example, the German weekly newspaper Die Zeit. They, at the end of the article, they tell the readers what sources they use, and they put a link to the website of the newspaper where they can actually look at some of the papers and see see the work the reporters did. So that's something that's, I think it's important to be that transparent, and also to give the readers the possibility to read some of the sources, some of the papers for themselves, and to get a broader perspective on the topic. And also the possibility of correcting mistakes is very important, and it's very important to be transparent about this. So I think it's very good that websites such as Zeit Online or Spiegel Online, they're very transparent about we corrected this, we added this number was not correct, so we corrected this. So I think that is very important to build trust.